The morning of May 11th, 1945, Radar Picket Station 15, 60 miles north of Okinawa. Commander Barton Mullany stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley, watching the horizon turn pink with dawn. His radar operators had been tracking contacts since 0740. Japanese aircraft. Dozens of them. Maybe more. At 0835, the first zero appeared, then another, then the sky filled with them. 156 enemy aircraft, all converging on Hadley and her sister ship Evans, along with 4 small landing craft support vessels. It was Kikusui Number 6, the 6th mass kamikaze attack of the Okinawa campaign. And every single one of those pilots intended to die. For the next 95 minutes, Hadley's crew would fight the most intense naval gun battle in American history. They would fire over 5,000 rounds. They would shoot down 23 enemy aircraft, an all-time record for a single ship in one engagement. But here's what the Japanese pilots diving toward them that morning didn't know. They didn't understand why American anti-aircraft fire had become so devastatingly accurate, why shells were exploding around their aircraft with impossible precision, why planes that should have reached their targets were tumbling from the sky in flames, shredded by fragments from explosions that missed them by 70 feet. The Japanese suspected something. They had theories, but they never discovered the truth. American 5-inch guns were firing shells equipped with a technology so revolutionary, so closely guarded, that it was protected at the same security level as the atomic bomb. The VT fuse, the proximity fuse, was turning kamikaze attacks into suicide missions with no hope of success. And the story of how that happened begins not with the battle, but with a crisis 18 months earlier, when Japan unveiled a tactic so terrifying that it threatened to derail the entire American advance across the Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. October 25th, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Lieutenant Yukio Seki led 5 Zero fighters off Mabalacat airfield in the Philippines. Each aircraft carried a 500-kilogram bomb strapped beneath its fuselage. None of the pilots expected to return. They were the first official kamikaze unit, the Shinpu Special Attack Corps, named after the divine wind that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century. Their target, American escort carriers supporting the invasion of the Philippines. At 10:47, Seki's Zero screamed down through anti-aircraft fire and slammed into the escort carrier street, low. The bomb detonated in the hangar deck. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship as aviation fuel and munitions ignited. Within 30 minutes, Street Low rolled over and sank. It was the first major warship ever destroyed by a kamikaze attack, and it announced to the United States Navy that the war in the Pacific had entered a new and terrifying phase. The kamikaze wasn't just a desperate tactic, it was a calculated response to an impossible situation. By late 1944, Japan's position was catastrophic. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June had destroyed Japanese naval aviation. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 3 Japanese carriers sunk, over 600 aircraft lost, most of Japan's remaining experienced pilots killed. The fall of Saipan in July gave B-29 superfortresses bases from which they could reach the Japanese home islands. Curtis LeMay's firebombing campaign would soon turn Japanese cities into infernos. Japan's aircraft were obsolete. The Zero fighter that had dominated Pacific skies in 1941 and 1942 was now outclassed by American Hellcats and Corsairs. Japanese in industry couldn't produce modern aircraft fast enough. More critically, Japan had lost the ability to train skilled pilots. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators underwent rigorous 3-year training programs, producing some of the world's finest pilots. By late 1944, replacement pilots received perhaps a few months of instruction. Many had less than 100 hours of flight time. They couldn't dogfight American pilots with 1,000 hours of experience. They couldn't execute complex bombing runs against ships protected by radar-directed guns and fighter cover, but they could fly straight at a target and crash into it. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, newly appointed commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, understood the mathematics of desperation. A conventional torpedo or dive-bombing attack against American carriers in late 1944 had perhaps a 2% success rate, 2 hits for every 100 sorties. The attackers would be intercepted by combat air patrols, shredded by anti-aircraft fire, their bombs or torpedoes easily evaded by maneuvering ships. Japan was expending aircraft and pilots at catastrophic rates for negligible results. Kamikaze attacks changed the equation. A pilot who aimed his entire aircraft at a target didn't need to release a bomb at the perfect moment. He didn't need to escape through fighter cover and anti-aircraft fire. He just needed to reach the target. And if a 5-ton aircraft loaded with explosives and aviation fuel hit a ship at 300 miles per hour, the results could be devastating. The statistics proved Onishi right. During the Philippines campaign from October 1944 through January 1945, kamikaze attacks achieved success rates that conventional attacks couldn't match. The Navy's Operations Research Group analyzed 1,444 Japanese aircraft attacks during this period. 352 were kamikazes. They scored 121 hits, a 34% success rate. 1 in 3 kamikazes damaged or sank a ship. The remaining 1,092 conventional attacks managed only 23 hits, a 2% success rate. Kamikaze attacks were 7 to 10 times more effective than conventional bombing. For American sailors, the kamikaze represented psychological warfare at its most brutal. You couldn't intimidate these pilots. You couldn't make them break off their attack. A kamikaze with his aircraft on fire, control surfaces shot away, would keep coming, pieces of the plane falling off, and still it would keep coming. Even if gunners killed the pilot, the dead man's momentum would carry his burning aircraft into the ship. The only way to stop a kamikaze was total destruction of the aircraft, quickly enough that the debris would miss the ship. American anti-aircraft doctrine in 1944 was built around the 5-inch 38 caliber gun. Nearly every destroyer, cruiser, and carrier mounted multiple 5-inch guns, firing 45-pound high-explosive shells up to 37,000 feet at rates of 15 to 22 rounds per minute per gun. These were excellent weapons. They'd been downing Japanese aircraft since 1942, but they had limitations. Most 5-inch shells fired during the war used time delay fuses. Before firing, a crew member would set a mechanical fuse to detonate after a specific number of seconds. The gun crew would track the target aircraft with radar, calculate its altitude and speed, determine how long the shell would take to reach that altitude, set the fuse, load the shell, and fire. If their calculations were correct, the shell would explode near the aircraft, sending fragments through its structure. If their calculations were off by even a second, the shell would explode harmlessly too early or too late. Against conventional attacks, this worked reasonably well. A Japanese bomber, making a torpedo run, flew a predictable path. You could calculate where it would be in 10 seconds, set your fuses, and fill that chunk of sky with explosions. But kamikazes were different. They dove. They maneuvered. They came in fast from multiple directions. The ballistic solution changed every second. By the time you calculated the fuse setting, loaded the shell, and fired, the kamikaze had moved. Your explosion detonated in empty sky while the aircraft screamed past. The numbers were brutal. During the Philippines campaign, ships firing time-fused 5-inch ammunition required an average of 1,162 shells to down a single kamikaze, over 1,000 shells. Some destroyers carried only 500 total rounds of 5-inch ammunition. They could expend their entire magazine and perhaps shoot down one aircraft, if they were lucky, if their calculations were perfect, if the kamikaze flew predictably, which they didn't. Smaller automatic weapons were even worse. The 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon guns that bristled from American warships could put up tremendous volumes of fire. Walls of steel, but their shells were too light. A kamikaze riddled with 40mm hits, leaking fuel, on fire, would keep coming. Often the aircraft would crash into the ship even after the pilot was dead, carried by sheer momentum and gravity. You needed to knock the aircraft out of the sky, not just damage it. But on that morning in January 1943, when USS Helena shot down those 2 Japanese dive bombers over Guadalcanal with just a few salvos, something different was happening, something the Japanese couldn't see. Helena's 5-inch guns were firing shells that didn't need perfect timing, shells that adjusted their own detonation, shells that exploded automatically when they sensed an aircraft nearby. The proximity fuse was the culmination of 3 years of work by some of America's brightest scientists, operating in complete secrecy. The story began in September 1940, when a British scientific mission arrived in the United States carrying one of the war's most important secrets, the cavity magnetron, which made modern radar possible. In exchange for American industrial capacity, Britain shared its most advanced military technology. Among the ideas the British brought was research into proximity fuses. British scientist William Butemont had proposed a concept, a fuse that used radio waves to detect aircraft and detonate automatically. The British had built crude prototypes for rockets, but rockets had low acceleration and didn't spin. Artillery shells were different. They experienced 20,000 times the force of gravity during firing and spun at 25,000 revolutions per minute. No electronic device could survive that, the British thought. They'd tried and failed. The US Navy, however, was desperate enough to try anything. Pearl Harbor was still 15 months in the future, but American military planners understood that war with Japan was likely, possibly inevitable, and they understood that naval battles would be decided by air power. Aircraft carriers were the new capital ships. Protecting carriers from Japanese aircraft was the Navy's highest priority. That meant better anti-aircraft weapons, which meant better fuses. In August 1940, the National Defense Research Committee assigned the problem to Section T of the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism in Washington, D.C. The director was Merle Tuve, a brilliant physicist who had helped develop radar. Tuve assembled a small team of scientists and engineers. Their mission: create a proximity fuse that could survive being fired from a 5-inch gun and reliably detonate near aircraft. And do it fast, because war was coming. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. You needed to fit a radio transmitter and receiver into a shell nose about the size of a pint milk bottle. The transmitter needed to broadcast continuously as the shell flew toward its target. The receiver needed to detect reflections from the target and measure their strength when the reflection was strong enough, meaning the shell was close to something large like an aircraft. Circuits needed to trigger detonation. All of this had to happen in fractions of a second, at the end of a flight that subjected every component to forces that would shatter normal electronics. The vacuum tubes were the first problem. Every radio of that era used vacuum tubes, glass bulbs containing delicate metal filaments. Standard vacuum tubes shattered instantly when subjected to the acceleration of gun firing. Sylvania Electric took on the challenge of designing ruggedized tubes. They studied hearing aid components, the smallest vacuum tubes then in existence. They reinforced the filaments. They developed new glass formulations. They tested thousands of prototypes in centrifuges and shock tests. Most failed. But slowly, painfully, Sylvania developed miniature tubes that could survive 20,000 G-forces. It was an engineering triumph. These tubes were smaller than a man's thumb, yet contained transmitters, receivers, and switching circuits. The battery was equally challenging. It needed to remain stable for years in storage, then activate instantly when the shell was fired. Normal batteries degraded over time. The solution was a reserve battery that kept its components separate until needed. When the shell was fired, the acceleration forced an electrolyte into contact with the battery's plates, activating it. Within milliseconds, the battery was powering the fuse's electronics. The circuits themselves required revolutionary design. Lloyd Berkner, one of Tuve's engineers, developed a system using separate transmitter and receiver tubes. The transmitter broadcast radio waves continuously. The receiver picked up reflections. When both tubes operated together, they created an interference pattern that intensified as the shell approached its target. At a certain signal strength, a thyrotron tube functioned as a switch, releasing stored electrical energy into a detonator. The shell exploded, sending fragments in all directions. By summer 1942, Section T had working prototypes. The program had grown beyond Carnegie's capacity, so Johns Hopkins University created the Applied Physics Laboratory specifically to house the proximity fuse project. Tuve became APL's director. The laboratory grew rapidly. Hundreds of scientists, engineers, and technicians worked on refining the design, improving reliability, preparing for mass production. Testing came in August 1942. The light cruiser USS Cleveland, on its shakedown cruise in Chesapeake Bay, fired proximity-fused shells at remote-controlled drone aircraft. The drones maneuvered, trying to evade. The shells tracked them, detonated nearby, shredded them with fragments. First drone, destroyed. Second drone, destroyed. Third drone, destroyed. 4 bursts of fire, 3 kills. The Navy cancelled the rest of the test and immediately ordered mass production. But production was its own challenge. Each proximity fuse contained about 130 miniaturized electronic components. Every component had to meet exacting specifications. Every fuse had to work reliably. You couldn't field test them in training, because duds might fall into enemy hands. The entire technology would be compromised. So every fuse had to work the first time, in combat, or Americans would die. The Navy contracted with 87 different firms operating 110 factories. Crosley Corporation, which had made radios and refrigerators before the war, became the largest single producer, eventually manufacturing over 5 million fuses. General Electric, RCA, Raytheon, Sylvania, Westinghouse, Eastman Kodak, Zenith, even Wurlitzer Organs, all contributed to production. Workers didn't know what they were making. The project was compartmentalized. Each factory produced specific components. Final assembly happened at secure facilities, where armed guards ensured nothing left the building except completed fuses in sealed containers. Production started slowly. In late 1942, factories produced about 500 fuses per day. By late 1943, production reached 40,000 per day. By war's end, 70,000 per day. Over 22 million proximity fuses were manufactured between 1942 and 1945 at a cost exceeding $1 billion. That's roughly $15 billion in today's money. Only the Manhattan Project and radar development cost more. The secrecy was absolute. The official name, variable time fuse, was deliberately misleading, suggesting an improved mechanical timer rather than a revolutionary electronic sensor. Production workers signed security oaths. Military personnel using the fuses received minimal information. They knew they had special ammunition with strict accountability requirements. Every fused shell fired had to be logged. Unexploded shells had to be recovered immediately. Ships patrolled areas where proximity-fused ammunition was used, preventing enemy recovery of duds. The security was so tight that Allied ground forces couldn't use proximity-fused artillery until December 1944 because the risk of capture was too high. Thousands of soldiers died because the technology was too secret to risk. Helena's success in January 1943 proved the concept. Through 1943 and into 1944, more ships received proximity-fused ammunition. Results were dramatic. Ships using proximity fuses shot down Japanese aircraft at 5 to 6 times the rate of ships using time-fused ammunition while expending far fewer shells. By 1943, though only 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition had proximity fuses, those shells accounted for 50% of aircraft shot down by naval guns. The fuses were 300% more effective than time-delayed fuses. But the Japanese didn't understand why. They noticed American anti-aircraft fire was more accurate. They developed theories. Better radar, perhaps? Faster fire control computers? Improved training? German intelligence, which shared information with Japan, suggested the Americans might have developed some kind of influence fuse, but German scientists had attempted similar projects and concluded they were impossible. The technical challenges couldn't be solved. So Japanese planners assumed American improvements were incremental, not revolutionary. This assumption would prove catastrophic when Japan committed to kamikaze tactics. The calculation that made kamikazes seem effective, that 1 in 3 would hit their targets, was based on pre-proximity fuse data. As American ships received more VT-fused ammunition through early 1945, the equation changed. But Japan didn't know that. They kept launching kamikazes, kept losing pilots and aircraft, never understanding that they were flying into a killing zone where American shells didn't need to hit them directly. Close was good enough. The Okinawa campaign, codenamed Operation Iceberg, was designed to give the United States a staging base for the invasion of Japan itself. The island sat only 340 miles from Kyushu, close enough for land-based fighters to provide cover for an invasion fleet. Close enough for bombers to pulverize Japanese defenses before American troops hit the beaches. Okinawa's capture was essential, and everyone knew it would be bloody. The invasion began on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, April Fool's Day. American troops stormed ashore expecting fierce resistance, but found the beaches almost undefended. The Japanese had learned from Iwo Jima. They'd withdrawn to fortified positions inland, where American naval gunfire and air support would be less effective. The ground battle would be brutal, costly, lasting until late June. But the real nightmare was at sea. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet supporting the invasion. Over 1,400 ships, from massive battleships to tiny landing craft. It was the largest American naval force ever assembled in the Pacific, and it would spend the next 3 months anchored off Okinawa, supporting troops ashore, vulnerable to attack from the air. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki commanded Japan's Fifth Air Fleet on Kyushu. He had perhaps 4,000 aircraft of all types, many obsolete, most flown by inexperienced pilots. But he also had a plan. The Japanese called it Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, a reference to the flower that symbolized the emperor. 10 massive kamikaze attacks, hundreds of aircraft each, coordinated to overwhelm American defenses. The goal wasn't to sink the entire fleet, just enough ships to make the invasion untenable, make it cost too much, make America reconsider, force negotiations instead of unconditional surrender. Kikusui Number 1 launched on April 6th and 7th. 355 kamikazes, 341 conventional attackers, 341 escort fighters, nearly 1,100 aircraft. They hit the fleet in waves. 6 ships sunk, dozens damaged. The destroyer Bush took 3 kamikaze hits and sank in 40 minutes. The destroyer Colholm took 4 hits and had to be scuttled. The destroyer Emmons took 5 kamikaze hits and lost 60 men. These weren't glancing blows. These were aircraft packed with explosives slamming into ships at 300 miles per hour. But something was different from the Philippines campaign. The kamikaze success rate was dropping. In the Philippines, 34% of kamikazes had hit ships. At Okinawa, the rate was falling toward 23%, then to 18%, then lower. More and more kamikazes were being shot down before reaching their targets. American gunners were getting better, yes. Tactics were improving, absolutely. But the real difference was happening in the shells themselves. By April 1945, the proportion of proximity-fused ammunition in American magazines had increased dramatically. Destroyers on radar picket duty, the ships positioned far from the main fleet to provide early warning of attacks, carried magazines that were 60 to 70% VT-fused shells. Some ships were authorized to fire 100% proximity-fused ammunition during kamikaze attacks, something that had never been permitted before. The radar picket stations were suicide posts, destroyers and smaller vessels positioned 50 to 80 miles from the main fleet, their radars scanning for incoming raids. When kamikazes appeared, the picket ships would direct fighter coverage and engage with their own guns. But they were isolated, vulnerable, often outnumbered. Between April 1st and June 30, 1945, 15 radar picket destroyers were sunk, 45 damaged. More than a third of all ships serving picket duty became casualties. but they were also proving grounds for proximity fuses under the most demanding conditions imaginable. A kamikaze attack on a picket ship was the worst-case scenario for anti-aircraft fire. Multiple targets, high speed, violent maneuvering, minimal time to engage. If proximity fuses could work here, they could work anywhere. The technical improvements since 1943 were substantial. The Mark 32 fuse used on Helena in early 1943 had perhaps a 70% reliability rate. 30% of shells were duds, either failing to detonate at all or detonating at the wrong time. By 1945, the Mark 53 fuse had pushed reliability above 85%, improved vacuum tubes, better batteries, refined circuits, more rigorous testing. The price had dropped too. Early fuses cost over $700 each. By 1945, mass production had reduced costs to $18 per fuse. The fuses also incorporated lessons from combat. Early versions could be confused by sea return, radar reflections from ocean waves. Engineers adjusted the circuitry to filter out wave reflections. The detonation range was optimized for different targets. Against low-flying aircraft, you wanted the shell to explode about 70 feet away. Against high-altitude bombers, slightly closer. The Mark 53 fuse could be set for different sensitivities before loading, allowing gunners to optimize performance for expected threats. Fire control had improved as well. The Mark 37 Director, which aimed guns on most American destroyers and cruisers, now incorporated better radar and analog computers. The SCR-584 radar, originally developed by MIT's Radiation Laboratory for land-based anti-aircraft guns, was being adapted for shipboard use. It could automatically track aircraft, calculate trajectories, and feed firing solutions to gun directors. Combined with proximity fuses, it transformed anti-aircraft fire from educated guessing into precision engagement. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious forces at Okinawa, understood exactly what proximity fuses meant for the campaign. In a message to the fleet in early April, he emphasized that VT-fused ammunition was to be used freely against kamikaze threats. The old restrictions about preserving secrecy were relaxed. The technology was too valuable, the threat too severe. Ships were authorized to expend proximity-fused ammunition as needed to survive. Security would be maintained through aggressive recovery of duds and naval patrols, preventing Japanese salvage. The Japanese tried everything to counter American anti-aircraft fire. They varied their tactics constantly. High-altitude approaches, then diving. Attacks. Low-level approaches, skimming the waves to hide in radar clutter. Twilight attacks, when the setting sun blinded gunners. Night attacks, when visual tracking was impossible. Mass attacks, attempting to overwhelm defenses with numbers. They even developed the Oka, a rocket-powered flying bomb carried beneath a bomber and released near the target. The pilot would ignite the rockets and aim himself at the ship, reaching speeds over 400 miles per hour. Nothing worked consistently. American defenses adapted faster than Japanese tactics evolved. Combat air patrols, the fighter coverage over the fleet, were reorganized into what Commander John Thatch called the Big Blue Blanket. More fighters, positioned farther from the fleet, operating in coordinated teams with radar picket ships. When radar detected incoming raids, fighters were vectored to intercept long before kamikazes reached the fleet. Many raids were broken up 30 to 40 miles out, shot down before ever seeing their targets. The ships that kamikazes did reach faced withering fire. A typical destroyer carried 5 5-inch guns, 6 or more 40mm mounts, and numerous 20mm guns. If 3 destroyers were stationed together on a picket, they could collectively fire nearly 200 rounds per minute from their main batteries alone, plus thousands of automatic weapon rounds. And if 60% of those 5-inch shells had proximity fuses, the sky around incoming aircraft became a meat grinder of explosions and steel fragments. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Kikusui Number 2 came on April 12th and 13th. 185 kamikazes. They damaged 10 ships, including the battleship Tennessee and the carrier Enterprise. But the success rate continued dropping. More kamikazes were being shot down, the horizon filled with burning aircraft, smoking trails as planes tumbled into the sea, intact enough to recognize but too damaged to threaten ships. Kikusui Number 3. April 15th and 16th. 165 kamikazes. The carrier Intrepid took a hit that killed 40 men and wounded another 90. The destroyer Laffey fought off 22 kamikazes in 80 minutes, taking 6 hits but surviving. Her gunners claimed 9 confirmed kills, possibly more. The Navy awarded Laffey the Presidential Unit Citation. But what the citation couldn't mention, was that Laffey's survival depended significantly on proximity-fused ammunition. Kikusui Number 4. April 27th and 28th. 115 kamikazes. Kikusui Number 5. May 3rd through 4th. 125 kamikazes. Each attack cost Japan irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. Each attack damaged American ships, killed American sailors. But the attacks weren't achieving their strategic objective. The invasion wasn't being called off. American ships were being repaired faster than kamikazes could sink them. The mathematics of attrition favored America, not Japan. Admiral Ugaki understood this. His intelligence officers compiled reports from surviving pilots and escort fighters. The reports described American anti-aircraft fire of impossible accuracy, shells exploding around aircraft with minimal dispersion, planes being knocked from the sky before reaching their targets. The reports noted that American ships seemed to have unlimited ammunition, firing continuously without pausing to adjust fire or conserve shells. Japanese planners developed theories. Perhaps American 5-inch guns had some kind of advanced fire control, allowing rapid adjustment of mechanical fuses. Perhaps American radar was sophisticated enough to track multiple targets simultaneously and engage each with precision. Perhaps American factories were producing such volumes of ammunition that ships could simply overwhelm any attack with sheer numbers of shells. All of these theories were partially correct, but they missed the fundamental truth. A captured American pilot, shot down during a raid on Kyushu, was interrogated about American anti-aircraft capabilities. He'd been a dive bomber pilot from the carrier Hornet, familiar with his ship's defenses. The interrogation report, later recovered from Japanese archives, shows that the pilot described improved radar, better fire control computers, and high-quality ammunition. But he never mentioned proximity fuses. He didn't know they existed. Most American combat personnel didn't know. The secret was that well kept. Even when Japanese forces captured an American ammunition dump during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, a dump containing proximity-fused artillery shells, they never recognized what they had. German intelligence examined the shells, noted they were heavier than standard shells, assumed the extra weight was simply more explosive. The shells were photographed, documented, stored. Never were they taken apart. Never did anyone discover the electronic components inside. The German assumption that proximity fuses were impossible blinded them to evidence in their hands. That intelligence was shared with Japan. The opportunity to understand American capabilities was lost. By early May 1945, Admiral Ugaki was planning Kikusui Number 6. It would be among the largest kamikaze attacks of the campaign, 150 aircraft, 70 Navy, 80 Army. The target would be the American fleet, but with particular focus on the fast carriers. These were the ships that launched the fighter sweeps over Japanese airfields, destroy the carriers, and kamikaze attacks would have a chance. Without American fighter coverage, kamikazes might achieve the success rates they'd seen in the Philippines. The attack was scheduled for May 10th and 11th. American intelligence, reading, Japanese radio traffic through code breaking, knew something was coming. Admiral Spruance's headquarters warned the fleet on May 10th to expect heavy raids. Radar picket ships went to full alert. Combat air patrols were reinforced. Every available fighter was prepared for launch. Ships topped off their magazines, particularly their proximity-fused ammunition. If this was going to be a major attack, they'd need every advantage. May 11th dawned clear over Okinawa. Visibility excellent, winds light, perfect flying weather, which was bad news for ships. The first radar contacts appeared around 0640. Multiple bogies, the Navy term for unidentified aircraft, heading south from Kyushu. More contacts appeared through the morning. By 0800, it was clear this would be a massive attack. Dozens of aircraft, probably over 100, all heading toward the American fleet. Radar Picket Station 15 sat 60 miles north of Point Bolo on Okinawa's east coast. It was one of the most exposed positions, directly in the path of raids coming from Kyushu. 2 destroyers were on station, USS Hugh W. Hadley and USS Evans. Supporting them were 4 small landing craft support ships, LCS 82, 83, 84, and LSM 193. The landing craft were essentially floating anti-aircraft platforms, 70 feet long, carrying several 20mm and 40mm guns. They couldn't survive a kamikaze hit, but they could add their fire to the destroyer's defences. Hadley was a Sumner-class destroyer, brand new, commissioned in November 1944. She displaced 2,200 tons, carried 6 5-inch guns in 3 twin mounts, and had a crew of 360. Commander Mullaney had taken command just months earlier. Most of his crew were young, early 20s, with limited combat experience. Hadley had participated in operations at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but nothing had prepared them for what was coming. Evans was a Fletcher-class destroyer, slightly smaller, older, more experienced. She'd survived Pearl Harbor, fought through the Solomon Islands campaign, supported landings in the Philippines. Her crew knew combat. Commander Robert Archer commanded Evans with the confidence of a veteran. Between the 2 destroyers, they had 12 5-inch guns, numerous automatic weapons, and magazines loaded heavily with proximity-fused ammunition. At 0835, the first kamikaze appeared. A Zero fighter, approaching from Hadley's starboard beam. Both destroyers opened fire simultaneously. The 5-inch guns thundered, their shells visible as they arced toward the target. Proximity fuses detonated around the Zero. Fragments shredded its wings. The aircraft staggered, smoking, and crashed into the sea dead ahead of Evans. First kill. 0839, another Zero, diving from high on Evans's starboard quarter. Evans' 5-inch guns engaged at 7,000 yards. Then the 40mm mounts joined in at 3,500 yards. The Zero caught fire. It kept coming, kept diving. More hits. The aircraft became a ball of flame and fell into the sea at 2,500 yards. Second kill. 0841, another Zero. Steep suicide dive aimed directly at Evans. The ship's automatic weapons opened fire. 20mm and 40mm shells walked up toward the diving aircraft. The Zero was hit repeatedly, pieces flying off, but it kept coming. More hits. The pilot was probably dead, but momentum carried the burning aircraft down. It hit the water 800 yards from Evans. Third kill in 6 minutes. Then the sky filled with them. Japanese tactics for Kikusui Number 6 called for mass attacks designed to overwhelm defences. Individual kamikazes were relatively easy to shoot down, even for inexperienced gunners. But 10 kamikazes attacking simultaneously from different directions created impossible choices. You couldn't engage them all. Some would. Get through. That was the theory. Flood the zone, accept losses, but achieve hits. 156 Japanese aircraft were converging on the small group of ships at Radar Picket Station 15. Zeros, Vals, Judies, Kates, every type of aircraft the Japanese could scrape together. Some were kamikazes, dedicated suicide attackers, piloted by men who'd written their final letters home. Others were escorts, experienced pilots assigned to suppress anti-aircraft fire and ensure kamikazes reached their targets. A few were reconnaissance aircraft, meant to observe and report results. Commander Mullaney on Hadley's bridge watched the radar repeater as the scope filled with contacts, dozens of blips, all closing. He ordered general quarters, though his crew was already at battle stations. Every gun manned, fire control teams calculating solutions, radar tracking multiple targets, radio operators coordinating with Evans and the landing craft, fighter controllers trying to vector combat air patrol to intercept. But there weren't enough fighters, not nearly enough. The kamikazes came in groups, 3 from the port side, 5 from starboard, 2 from ahead. Hadley's gun director tried to prioritize targets, close ones first, then aircraft on collision courses, then damaged aircraft that might still hit. But the targeting problem was overwhelming. Analog computers couldn't keep up. Human gunners were making split-second decisions, training guns on threats, firing, shifting to new targets. The 5-inch guns fired in controlled bursts, 2 or 3 rounds per target. Watch for the proximity fuse detonations. If the aircraft staggered or fell away, shift to the next threat. If it kept coming, keep firing. The guns' magazines were loaded with mixed ammunition, some armor-piercing shells for surface targets, some high-explosive time-fused shells, but 60% proximity-fused shells. The VT ammunition was color-coded, brass shells with blue bands. Gunners learned to recognize them, to feel the slight extra weight from the electronic components. 0854, a Judy dive bomber approached from high on Hadley's port quarter. Both destroyers engaged, the sky between the ships and the aircraft filled with black puffs from proximity detonations. The Judy was hit, pieces flew off. The aircraft lost control, tumbling, and crashed 2,000 yards away. 4th kill. 0856, a Val dive bomber came from starboard. Hadley and Evans engaged. The Val caught fire. It tried to pull out of its dive but couldn't. The aircraft cartwheeled into the sea 1,500 yards from Hadley. 5th kill. 0858, a 0 from dead ahead. Evans engaged first. Hits observed. The 0 began smoking but stayed on course. Hadley's forward guns opened fire. More hits. The proximity fuses were detonating perfectly, each shell exploding as it passed the 0, fragments ripping through the aircraft. The 0 disintegrated in mid-air and fell in pieces into the water. 6th kill. The landing craft were engaging too now. Their lighter guns couldn't reach targets as far out as the destroyers could, but when kamikazes penetrated close, the landing craft added walls of automatic weapons fire. Tracers crisscrossed the sky. Shell splashes dotted the sea where wounded aircraft crashed. Smoke rose from multiple impact points, and still they kept coming. 0900. 7 kamikazes attacked simultaneously from different directions. This was the nightmare scenario. Hadley's gun directors could only track 3 targets at once. Human gunners had to manually engage the others. Training took over. Point at the threat. Fire. Shift. Fire. Don't think about the aircraft getting closer. Don't think about the bomb under its fuselage or the fuel in its tanks. Just fire. The proximity fuses were saving them. Every shell that detonated near an aircraft had a chance of destroying it. You didn't need direct hits. Close was good enough. A fragment, through the engine, through a wing spar, through the pilot, any of these would kill the attack. And Hadley's crew was firing perhaps 200 rounds per minute from their 5-inch guns alone. If 60% had proximity fuses, that was 120 opportunities per minute for a lucky hit. 3 of the 7 kamikazes were shot down short of the destroyers. 1 hit the water 1,000 yards out, victim of a proximity detonation that severed its tail. Another exploded in mid-air when fragments hit its bomb. A third lost control, smoking, and spiraled into the sea, but 4 were still coming. Evans' guns concentrated on a 0 diving on her from starboard. The aircraft was hit repeatedly, burning, falling, but it hit the water only 50 yards from Evans's side. The explosion sent up a geyser that drenched the destroyer's deck. Close, too close. The bombardier pilot was good, or lucky. The aircraft jinked, dodging, making targeting difficult. Hadley's guns followed, firing continuously. Proximity detonations erupted around the Val. It took hits, smoking, banking, still coming. More hits. The valve's canopy shattered. The aircraft snap-rolled and hit the water 300 yards out. Personnel on Hadley's deck were thrown to the ground by the shock of the explosion. 2 more kamikazes were shot down within seconds. The proximity fuses were working as designed. The American gunners were well-trained, disciplined, keeping their nerve despite aircraft diving at them from every direction. And the VT ammunition kept detonating precisely, filling the sky with fragments. But no defensive system is perfect. 0907, a Zero penetrated close to Evans. The destroyer's guns hit it repeatedly. The aircraft was on fire, pieces falling off, but its momentum carried it into Evans' superstructure just behind the bridge. The impact hurled men across the deck. The Zero's bomb detonated, ripping a hole in Evans's side. Fires broke out immediately. Power failed to several gun mounts. Evans slowed, her engineering spaces damaged, unable to maintain speed. Evans was hurt but still fighting. Commander Archer, blood running down his face from a head wound, stayed on the bridge directing damage control and gunfire. His crew kept fighting. The 5-inch guns that still had power continued engaging targets. 40mm crews kept firing despite casualties around them, but Evans couldn't maneuver. She was essentially dead in the water, a sitting target. Hadley now bore the brunt of the attack. With Evans crippled, more kamikazes focused on the still mobile destroyer. Commander Mullaney ordered emergency flank speed, maneuvering radically to avoid incoming aircraft. But radical maneuvering made accurate gunnery nearly impossible. The gun directors couldn't stabilize properly when the ship was heeling hard over in emergency turns. 0912, a Betty bomber appeared. Large, twin-engine, much bigger than fighters, and slung beneath it, visible through binoculars, an Oka rocket bomb. The Betty approached from altitude, trying to get close enough to release its deadly payload. If the Oka launched, it would accelerate to over 400 miles per hour. Nothing could stop it at that speed. Every gun on Hadley that could bear on the Betty opened fire. The 5-inch guns fired as fast as crews could load. Proximity detonations surrounded the bomber. Fragments hit. The Betty's left engine began smoking. More hits. The right engine caught fire. The Betty was dying, but it released the Oka anyway. The rocket bomb dropped away from the mothership, fell for a moment, then its rockets ignited. The Oka accelerated directly at Hadley, 400 miles per hour, 2,600 pounds of explosive in the nose. Unstoppable once launched, Hadley's automatic weapons engaged. Streams of tracers converged on the rocket bomb. It was so fast, but one of Hadley's 5-inch mounts, gun 53, got off a single shot. The shell was proximity fused. The VT fuse detonated 70 feet from the Oka. Fragments hit the rocket bomb's thin aluminum skin. Fuel tanks ruptured. The rocket's solid fuel ignited catastrophically. The Oka exploded in mid-air 400 yards from Hadley, a massive fireball that sent debris raining into the sea. Hadley steamed through the splash, her crew cheering despite everything. They'd just shot down the fastest aircraft in the Japanese arsenal. But there was no time to celebrate. More kamikazes were diving. 0917, a Judy bomber penetrated Hadley's defensive fire and hit the ship's afterdeck house. The impact destroyed the after-engine room. Fires broke out. The ship's speed dropped immediately. Hadley slowed, then stopped, power lost, engines flooded. Now both destroyers were immobilized, and the kamikazes kept coming. 0920, another Judy hit Hadley near the forward stack. The bomb penetrated the deck before exploding, ripping through compartments, killing men, starting more fires. Hadley was listing to starboard now, her fantail settling as water flooded damaged compartments. Ammunition began cooking off in the fires, 5-inch shells exploding, 40mm rounds rattling off like firecrackers. Men were abandoning their stations, forced away by flames and heat, but some gun crews stayed. Gun Mount 51, the forward 5-inch mount, still had power. Its crew kept firing at kamikazes still circling for attack runs. Mount 53, despite fires raging around it, continued engaging targets. The crews knew that if they stopped shooting, more aircraft would hit, and the ship would certainly sink. So they kept firing. Loading, firing, loading, firing. 0925. A 0 dove on Hadley from high astern, Mount 53 engaged. The proximity-fused shells detonated around the 0. The aircraft was hit, smoking, but kept coming. More rounds, more hits. The 0 caught fire, but its dive continued. It crashed into the sea 20 yards from Hadley's stern. The explosion lifted the destroyer's fantail out of the water, bending hull plates, flooding more compartments. The landing craft were fighting desperately now. LCS-82 had been hit by a kamikaze 0910 and was sinking. Her survivors were in the water. LCS-83 had taken near misses that damaged her hull and killed several crew members. But the remaining landing craft kept firing, their light guns adding to the defensive fire that was somehow keeping most kamikazes at bay. Combat Air Patrol arrived at 0927, Corsairs from the carriers, 6 of them, diving into the swarm of Japanese aircraft. The fighters shot down kamikazes and escorts alike. The sky became a chaos of burning aircraft, parachutes from ditched American pilots, explosions, smoke. The Corsairs' arrival turned the battle. Kamikazes that had been focusing on the crippled destroyers now had to evade fighters. Many were shot down before reaching attack positions. But the damage was done. Hadley was dying. Her list increased to 30 degrees. The fantail was almost underwater. Fires raged amidships, beyond the ability of damage control parties to contain them. Commander Mullaney stood on the bridge, looking at the damage assessment. 3 kamikaze hits, 1 bomb hit, multiple near misses, 151 casualties, 30 dead, over 100 wounded. The ship was finished. He gave the hardest order of his career: abandon ship. But not everyone. Mullaney called for volunteers to stay aboard and try to save Hadley. 50 men volunteered immediately. Officers, chiefs, sailors, it didn't matter. They stayed while the rest of the crew went over the side into life rafts. Mullaney ordered all flags raised. If Hadley was going down, she'd go down with colours flying. The volunteers fought the fires. They jettisoned topside weight to reduce the list. They shored up damaged bulkheads. They pumped water from flooded compartments. For hours they worked, while kamikazes still circled overhead and the Corsairs kept them at bay. Slowly, impossibly, the fires came under control. The list stabilized. Hadley stopped settling. The ship wasn't sinking. Not yet. Evans was also fighting to survive. Commander Archer had organized his crew into damage control parties despite his own injuries. They'd contained the fires from the kamikaze hit. They'd patched hull damage well enough to reduce flooding. 4 more kamikazes had tried to hit Evans after she'd been crippled. All 4 were shot down by Evans's remaining guns and the landing craft. Evans' crew had splashed 15 kamikazes total and assisted on 4 more. Now they waited for help. The fleet tug USS Cree arrived at 1400 to take Evans in tow. Slowly, carefully, the crippled destroyer was pulled away from Radar Picket Station 15 toward the safety of Karama-Reto, the fleet anchorage. Evans would make it. She'd be towed all the way to Mare Island Navy Yard in San Francisco for repairs. But she'd lost 32 men killed, 27 wounded. Her war was over. Hadley's volunteers kept her afloat until tugs arrived. The destroyer was towed to Karama-Reto, then eventually across 6,100 miles of ocean to San Francisco. The tow took weeks. Hadley never sailed again under her own power, but she made it home, and her crew, those who survived, had set a record that stands to this day. 23 enemy aircraft shot down by a single ship in one engagement. 23. The official action reports filed after May 11th were matter-of-fact, clinical. They listed aircraft engaged, ammunition expended, casualties suffered. Hadley reported firing over 5,700 rounds of 5-inch ammunition during the 95-minute battle. Evans reported nearly 4,000 rounds. The landing craft added thousands more from their automatic weapons. The reports documented a tremendous volume of fire against an overwhelming enemy force. What the reports didn't emphasize, couldn't emphasize due to security restrictions, was the role of proximity fuses. The after-action analysts who studied the battle understood. Of Hadley's 5,700 5-inch rounds fired, approximately 3,400 were proximity-fused. That's roughly one VT shell detonating every 2 seconds for 95 minutes. Each detonation created a lethal fragment pattern covering thousands of cubic yards of airspace. The kamikazes were flying into a constantly regenerating field of explosions and shrapnel. The statistical analysis was classified, but it was conclusive. Ships firing predominantly time-fused ammunition at Okinawa required an average of 1,162 rounds to down a single kamikaze. Ships with 60% VT-fused ammunition, like Hadley and Evans, required approximately 310 rounds per kill, nearly a 4-to-1 improvement. The proximity fuse was making the difference between survival and destruction. The Japanese never understood this. Ugaki's headquarters received reports from the few pilots who survived Kikusui Number 6. They described intense anti-aircraft fire. They mentioned that American ships seemed to fire continuously without pause. They noted that aircraft were being hit by fragments from explosions that seemed to occur spontaneously in mid-air, but they never grasped the mechanism. Japanese intelligence reports from May 1945 speculated about American advances in fire control, radar, and ammunition quality. They were correct about all of those things, but they missed the revolutionary technology that was actually killing their pilots. Kikusui Number 6 cost Japan 150 aircraft, including the approximately 70 kamikazes that actually attacked ships. In exchange, they sank one destroyer escort, damaged the carriers Bunker Hill and Enterprise, and damaged several other ships. The carrier Bunker Hill's damage was severe, 496 men killed and wounded. But the strategic situation hadn't changed. The invasion continued. American ships remained off Okinawa. The attacks weren't working. Ugaki launched 4 more Kikusui attacks through June. Each cost hundreds of aircraft. Each achieved fewer results than the previous one. American defenses improved constantly. More proximity-fused ammunition reached the fleet. Tactics evolved. The big blue blanket fighter coverage became increasingly effective. Japanese losses mounted while American losses decreased. By mid-June, kamikaze success rates had dropped below 10%. 1 in 10 kamikazes was hitting ships. The tactic that had seemed so effective in October 1944 was failing by June 1945. The reason was simple: technology. The VT fuse had transformed anti-aircraft defense from an art into a science. Pre-proximity fuse, shooting down an aircraft required perfectly calculated timing, prediction of the target's future position, and precise mechanical fuse setting. Human error at any step meant a miss. Post-proximity fuse, you just needed to get shells near the target. The electronics handled the rest. American industry's ability to produce proximity fuses at massive scale was equally important. By mid-1945, production had reached 70,000 fuses per day. The cost had dropped to $18 per unit. Quality control maintained failure rates below 15%. The logistics system ensured that every ship received adequate stocks of VT ammunition. This wasn't just a technical triumph, it was an industrial triumph, demonstrating America's ability to design, mass-produce, and deploy revolutionary technology faster than enemies could adapt. The secrecy lasted until September 1945. After Japan's surrender, the War Department declassified the proximity fuse program. The announcement called it one of the most important weapons developed during the war, surpassed in effectiveness only by the atomic bomb. That's high praise, but it was justified. The proximity fuse hadn't just saved ships, it had enabled operations. Without VT fuses, the kamikaze threat might have been severe enough to delay or cancel the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The casualties would have been unbearable. The proximity fuse made those operations survivable. Japanese scientists and military officers learned about proximity fuses during the occupation. American technical teams explained the technology to their former enemies as part of intelligence-gathering efforts to understand Japanese knowledge of Allied capabilities. The reactions were recorded: shock, disbelief, humiliation. Japanese engineers had attempted to develop similar devices in the 1930s and concluded they were impossible. Learning that America had not only developed them, but mass-produced 22 million of them was devastating. Vice Admiral Ugaki, who'd commanded the kamikaze campaign, was interrogated after the war. He told American intelligence officers that Japanese forces had suspected some kind of improved fusing mechanism, possibly based on radar principles. But they'd never imagined miniature electronics that could survive gunfiring. They'd assumed such technology was decades away. Ugaki committed suicide before the full extent of American technical superiority was revealed to him. Perhaps it was better that way. The kamikaze campaign at Okinawa demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of suicide tactics. Between April 1st and June 22nd, 1945, approximately 1,900 kamikazes attacked American ships. They sank 26 ships and damaged 164 others. They killed nearly 5,000 American sailors and wounded another 5,000. The psychological impact was severe. Kamikaze attacks caused more casualties than any other naval action in the Pacific War. But kamikazes didn't change the outcome. They didn't stop the invasion of Okinawa. They didn't force America to negotiate. They didn't save Japan. What they did accomplish was demonstrate that modern air defense required more than courage and determination. It required technology. And in 1945, America had that technology. Japan didn't. The proximity fuse went on to influence post-war weapons development. Modern air defense missiles use proximity fuses. Anti-aircraft guns use them. Even artillery shells and bombs use variations of the technology. The basic principle, using electronics to sense proximity to a target and trigger detonation, became fundamental to modern warfare. Every surface-to-air missile fired in combat since 1945 owes something to Merle Tuvey's team at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. For the men who fought on Hadley and Evans on May 11, 1945, the technology was secondary. They knew they had good ammunition. They'd been told it was special, that they should use it freely against kamikazes. But they didn't know about the miniature radios, the vacuum tubes surviving 20,000 G-forces, the batteries activating in milliseconds, the circuits deciding in fractions of a second whether to detonate. They just knew that when they fired, aircraft died. And that was enough. Hadley received the Presidential Unit Citation for her actions on May 11th. Evans received the same honor. The citations praised the extraordinary heroism and distinguished service of the crews. 121 Purple Hearts were awarded to Hadley's crew alone. 20 individual medals for valor. The citations mentioned outstanding gunnery and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. All true, but incomplete. The complete truth is that Hadley and Evans survived because American scientists, working in secret for 3 years, solved problems that enemies thought were impossible. Because American industry, mobilized for war, produced revolutionary technology at unprecedented scale. Because American workers, many of them women who never knew what they were making, assembled millions of proximity fuses in factories across the country. Because American logistics delivered those fuses to ships fighting on the far side of the world. And because American gunners, young men barely out of their teens, used that technology to defend their ships and their lives. The Japanese diving toward Hadley and Evans that morning expected to die. They'd written their farewell letters. They'd said goodbye to families. They'd accepted that their lives would end in fire and explosion, sacrificing themselves for the Emperor. What they didn't expect was that American technology would deny them even that final accomplishment. Most never reached their targets. They were swatted from the sky by explosions they didn't understand, killed by fragments from shells that detonated before hitting them, victims of a weapon they didn't know existed. The irony is profound. The kamikaze tactic was born from desperation, from the realization that Japanese technology and training couldn't match American capabilities in conventional combat. So Japan turned to suicide, to human determination and sacrifice. But America responded not with similar sacrifice, but with better technology. Shells that thought for themselves, electronics that made split-second decisions, Industrial capacity that could produce millions of sophisticated devices and deliver them to every ship in the fleet. It was a contest between two philosophies of warfare. Japan bet on the will to die. America bet on the ability to produce. One kamikaze pilot represented months of training, an aircraft worth thousands of yen, fuel that Japan desperately needed elsewhere. One proximity fuse represented $18 and a few ounces of electronics, but that $18 device could kill the $1,000 pilot and his aircraft. The exchange ratio favored America overwhelmingly. This wasn't just about killing efficiency, it was about systems. The proximity fuse worked because it was part of a larger system. Radar to detect targets, fire control computers to calculate solutions, well-trained crews to operate weapons, reliable ammunition production, efficient logistics, constant tactical evolution. Take away any component and the system degraded. Japan couldn't match any single component, let alone the integrated whole. They were fighting industrial-age warfare with determination and courage that belonged to an earlier era. The battles off Okinawa were among the last major naval engagements of World War II. 2 months after Kikusui Number 6, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The kamikaze threat ended. But the lessons remained. Modern warfare wasn't won by individual heroism alone. It was won by nations that could mobilize their entire economies, their scientific establishments, their industrial capacity, that could produce new weapons faster than enemies could adapt, that could deploy revolutionary technology at scale. The proximity fuse proved that a small team of scientists, given adequate resources and freedom to innovate, could change the course of a war. Section T at Johns Hopkins never numbered more than a few hundred people, but their work saved thousands of lives, maybe tens of thousands. It enabled operations that would have been impossibly costly otherwise. It shortened the war by making Japanese tactics ineffective. Can you put a value on that? The billion-dollar cost seems trivial compared to the results achieved. After the war, Applied Physics Laboratory continued working on defense problems. They developed the first operational cruise missile. They contributed to early satellite programs. They pioneered missile defense technology. APL still exists today, still affiliated with Johns Hopkins University, still working on classified projects that probably won't be discussed publicly for decades. The legacy of Merle Tuvey's wartime team endures. The men who served on Hadley and Evans eventually learned what they'd been shooting. Years after the war, after declassification, veterans groups held reunions where the full story could be told. Former Hadley crewmen learned about the proximity fuse, about the Manhattan Project-level secrecy, about the industrial mobilization to produce millions of units. Some were amazed, some felt vindicated. They'd known their ammunition was special, but not how special. Some were simply grateful to understand why they'd survived when so many others hadn't. Commander Mullaney, Hadley's captain, retired from the Navy as a rear admiral. He never forgot May 11, 1945. In interviews decades later, he credited his crew's training, courage, and determination. But he also acknowledged the technology. "We had equipment the Japanese didn't know about," he said. "Equipment that made our guns 5 times more effective. Without it, we wouldn't have lasted 30 minutes. He was probably right. The kamikazes who attacked Radar Picket Station 15 that morning were brave. They flew toward their deaths deliberately, accepting destruction as the price of damaging enemy ships. In a different context, perhaps, that courage might have been enough. But in May 1945, courage wasn't sufficient. Technology mattered, industrial capacity mattered, and America had both in abundance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.